Well, hello, friends. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode. And actually, the season 1, season finale episode of Reading Michael Jackson. I am, of course, your host, Lena, and I am really happy and emotional and excited about being here with you today for this final episode. We have gone through an entire book this year. We have had 46 regular episodes of this show, in which every single episode we have discussed a different piece from Dancing the Dream. We read the entire book in order. We talked about the artwork. At times, we talked about photography. Most importantly, we talked about every single piece of writing that Michael did in this book. And I, for one, am very proud to say that all of us got through this entire year, week to week, with a sustained interest and effort to understand this man more. So I am really happy to be here today in this final reflective piece. It's an interesting episode for me because it's the first time I am not analyzing anything Michael wrote, or at least not anything he wrote for Dancing the Dream. This is going to be a discussion overall of the experience of reading this book, analyzing this book, recording these episodes. This is going to be an opportunity to talk about what Michael himself said about Dancing the Dream and what some other writers say about Dancing the Dream too, people who have spent some time analyzing in an effort to understand Michael Jackson. So I want this to be a fairly comprehensive episode and hopefully give you something even more to think about as we close this chapter of our Reading Michael Jackson journey. As I mentioned so many months ago at this point, I started this podcast with a desire to use Michael's own words, narrative, language, etc., to further understand him. So to both read Michael Jackson's work, but to also read/interpret Michael Jackson himself. Now, as a writer, it would terrify me. It would terrify me if people read my writing as a method of discerning and interpreting who I am. So I do want to give the disclaimer that obviously we have spent, or I have spent the last year making a lot of statements about Michael, based on what I'm reading, interpreting what I assume are his own philosophies about life, his own personal feelings, his own personal struggles. Everything I have said in this podcast, I have said in an effort to authentically understand and do so in a respectful way. But as with everything I will say today, everything I've said in this whole podcast has been my interpretation. So the truth is, we don't know how Michael truly felt about this work. We don't know how he intended for us to read it or understand it. But I feel confident and proud because I have made an effort. And if you've been here too, whether you've agreed with my interpretations or not, you've also made an effort to further digest and dissect and understand him. And I think that's one of the best things we could do as fans of him, especially as a person and cultural figure who is so often disregarded and so often cast aside as people make assumptions about him. So I'm really excited to get into this episode today. Now, what I want to do is actually start with an interview that Michael did in which he discusses Dancing the Dream. Now, this is an interview that is entirely in text. There is no audio or video recording of it. And so I am going to read the interview to you. I know that may be a little awkward. I will try to make it as easy to follow as possible. But this was an interview that was published in the Chicago Tribune newspaper on August 16th, 1992. I was 4 years old. And Michael was out there talking about all these things. Who knew that all these years later, I would be here recording about this very interview? Life is strange, isn't it? So what I'm going to do is read the text of the interview. I will make it clear when there is a question, and I will make it clear when it is Michael answering. And then we'll use this as a jumping off point for further discussing the book and how I interpreted it and what I took from it. Okay, so this is an interview with Michael Jackson from the Chicago Tribune, August 16th, 1992. Between performances on his whirlwind European tour, Michael Jackson agreed to this rare interview with Glenn Plaskin. An emissary was sent to hand deliver the questions to Jackson in Germany after his Munich concert, whereupon he dictated his answers, which were then transmitted to his literary agent in Washington, D.C. The answers were typed and faxed to Plaskin for publication. Question. I like that you care, drawing attention in your new book, Dancing the Dream, to, quote, a child crying in Ethiopia, a seagull struggling pathetically in an oil spill, a teenage soldier trembling with terror. Do you think we've become numb to all of this? Michael. No, I don't think we've become numb to these tragedies. We are seeing a worldwide resurgence and restoration of basic human values and concern for the sacredness of all life on our planet. Question. Your book is filled with an old soul's wisdom about life. Do you think of yourself as a philosopher? Michael. I don't think of myself as a philosopher. I think I have a purpose, as does everyone else on earth. To find that purpose and to live to express it is to ignite the spark of divinity within all of us. Question. Did all the poems and essays in the book come from a daily journal? Michael. I don't keep a journal. Ideas gestate and incubate in my mind. Question. You always say dreaming is so important. Have you realized all of your dreams? Michael. No, I haven't. Without dreams, there is no creativity. The creative urge in us comes from discontent, a divine discontent that seeks to change, to transform, to fill the world with more magic. My priority in life is to make a difference, to tread unfamiliar, uncharted territory, and to leave some trails behind. Question. What do you like about kids, and how do they revive you when you feel burdened? Michael. Children are innocent, and they are non-judgmental. They revive me because they help me find my own inner child, without whom I would be lost. From children, we can learn to love, to forgive, to create anew in everything, and to heal the world. Question. When you're alone, do you feel lonely or contented? Michael. I know how to experience solitude. Loneliness can be a harsh experience, but solitude is love and consciousness with all of life. Question. You often speak of God and spirituality, and you were reared as a Jehovah's Witness. Do you consider yourself a religious person today? Michael. I don't consider myself religious in the sense of subscribing to a particular dogma. I would consider myself spiritual in that I believe there is a domain of awareness in which we can experience our universality. I read all kinds of religious literature because I believe there is truth in all of them. Question. In your book's essay, Trust, you write, we think separating ourselves from others will protect us, but that doesn't work. It leaves us feeling alone and unloved. Do you feel imprisoned by your fame? Michael. Yes, fame can be imprisoning, but the best part of being Michael Jackson is that I know I can interact with millions of people, and in that interaction, we exchange something. Question. Which is? Michael. Love. It is exhilarating. It is magic. Question. I bet you could have been a great ballet dancer. Your mother once said you could imitate almost any dance move by the time you were 5. When you're dancing on stage, how does it feel, and how hard do you work at it? Michael. I dance to express my bliss. I do not strain at practice when I'm dancing. I just feel that the dance is dancing itself through me. I'm an instrument for the expression of ecstasy. Question. Give us a few secrets. What do you eat? How do you exercise? Michael: my life is not constrained by special diets or exercise routines. I have fun with my friends or by myself. I like to see movies, read books, dance, and sometimes do nothing. Question: you write so much about animals. What can we all learn from them? Michael: animals do not kill out of cruelty, greed, or jealousy, and most do not kill their own kind. We are the only animals that plunder and destroy the earth. But we are learning, and it's not too late. Question: speaking of animals, after the sexy, violent panther section of Black or White created so much controversy, amateur psychologists speculated that you were letting off tremendous feelings of anger about... Michael: anger and rage are the prelude to a shift in consciousness. Unless we feel rage at some of the inequities and injustices of our society, there is no hope for transformation. Question: your videos are state of the art, like a mini motion picture. Would you like to make feature-length films? Michael: I'm going to produce and direct many feature films. Movies that bring out the magic of life, that entertain, but also make people think. Question: in the meantime, when you're composing songs for your next album, do the words come first or the music? Michael: I first hear the music and feel the dance, and then the words come spontaneously. Question: in your essay on Children of the World, you say so many children have had their childhood stolen from them. As a child star, did you feel that way? Michael: I certainly did not have a routine childhood, but the magic was always there. Question: we've all seen Elizabeth Taylor fight so passionately for AIDS funding and compassion. What quality do you like most about her as a friend? Michael: Elizabeth has passion for life. We must live with passion. Question: having hosted Elizabeth Taylor's wedding last October, do you dream that one day you might have a wedding of your own? Michael: my life is the present, and the excitement of life is to step into the unknown every morning. I look forward to the future, whatever it brings. So reading this is really interesting to me, especially when we're trying to look at Dancing the Dream. There are not, unfortunately, that many instances of Michael talking about this book in a public setting. Now, I know there was an interview he did, I want to say a televised interview he did sometime in the mid-90s, in which he directly said that Dancing the Dream was more autobiographical to him than Moonwalk was. But Dancing the Dream as a book and as a work of Michael's craft and art is really under-discussed. And I'm really not sure why. Perhaps because, as far as I know, it was not massively successful commercially, which is a little bit odd considering it was like the height of Michael's career in a lot of ways when this was released. It's very surprising to me that it did not sell more, but I assume it's because of the nature of it not being about like gossip and juicy details of his life. I would have bought it just for the pictures, honestly. But I wonder if perhaps that's why Michael didn't talk about it that often, because maybe that bothered him that it wasn't as commercially successful as Moonwalk was, which was a bestseller, or obviously his own music. But when I look at this interview in the context of, okay, this is one of few times we ever have that Michael talks about Dancing the Dream, I have to say I'm a little disappointed by it. Now, let me be clear. I love the wisdom in some of his answers and the obviously crafted answers, because I think he likely gave real thought to how to respond to this. But in having read this whole book and now reading this again, I've read this interview in the past, of course, but reading it again, I feel like he really avoided vulnerability here. And I understand that. I'm not criticizing Michael for this, because despite the fact that the Dangerous Tour was massively successful and Michael was selling out stadiums around the entire globe. He was really being ridiculed and harassed in the press about his appearance and literally anything they could. This was even pre-allegations. He was really harassed. I imagine he was operating a bit on the defense when it came to how to talk about these things. But the impression that I get when I look at this is that Michael almost had a predetermined way he was comfortable talking about the book and talking about the themes in the book that would not reveal more than the book does. And so I feel like he sort of keeps us at a distance in this interview. And just the nature of it having been sent to his literary agent first, I'm assuming the language was crafted to make it sound good. And, so it makes me a little bit sad that one of the only times we have of him actually talking about this book is kind of like a controlled narrative, Unfortunately, there's not a tremendous amount of back and forth in this interview, and I wish there could have been. Because, for example, when Michael says that he doesn't think we are becoming numb to these tragedies in the world, he says we are seeing a worldwide resurgence and restoration of basic human values and concern for the sacredness of life on our planet. And I would love to ask him what he was referring to specifically, and where are we seeing this? Is this being seen in the general public? Is it being seen in national and international conversation? I want to know what his perspective was there, because it doesn't entirely align with some of the things that he wrote in the book. I mean, in the book, it almost feels like he's pleading for this to be the case, but recognizes it's not entirely, but that we can control our own behavior when it comes to that. I don't know. So those kinds of things made me want to know more. When he says, I don't think of myself as a philosopher, I think I have a purpose, as does everyone else, I really want to ask further. Okay, so you don't think you're a philosopher, but you put out a book that is very philosophical. Like, what was your reason for that? How does your decision to put out this book align with your purpose? I would like to know the answer to some of those questions, because even though I can infer, I want to know from Michael. When he looked at his entire career and his life and his creative output, where and how does he fit this book in? As we were reading and finishing the book, I did find myself feeling like I sort of understood his goal in the book more than I had at the start. So I don't think it's that it's not obvious. I think it's more that creating a book like this does take time and effort, and it's vulnerable to share with the world what your perspectives are on world issues and on life and philosophy and whatnot. So I'm just really curious what his intention was behind releasing it. And I don't feel we really get to that in this interview. So it frustrates me a bit. Again, I'm not saying I dislike anything he said. I just wish it went deeper. Do you know what I mean? I like having at least this foundation for us to be thinking about the way that Michael talked about this book, so that as we go through the rest of this episode and we think about it more, we can kind of jump away from that. Something I do wish I had more information about also is he was asked if he keeps a daily journal, and he said he doesn't, and that the ideas are just in his mind. But that doesn't get to the actual writing process, does it? So I'm a little bit frustrated that the interviewer wasn't more specific. This is a problem I often see in interviews where the question itself is a projection. So did all these things come from a daily journal? First of all, there's a yes or no question, which is never a good question to ask. But secondly, you're setting up this expectation for what his process may have looked like. What I would like to ask is, when did you write these? Because you can say you have all these ideas in your head, but when do you sit down to actually put it on paper? That's the magic. The thought itself, I think Michael may agree with this. The actual thought of creating is all beautiful and wonderful, but until you actually create it, it doesn't completely exist. It can exist in the ether, but it doesn't exist in a way that can be consumed by anyone. So I think I've always felt a frustration that interviewers don't dig into his process more. At the same time, Michael was not tremendously forthcoming when it came to answering some of these questions. So it's a combination of, I think, interviewing that leaves a little bit to be desired, at least in my opinion, and a person who was so self-protective that it became difficult to actually get a clear idea of where he was coming from at times, So with that said, we're going to set this interview aside. There's a lot more I could say about it, but it would be getting far deeper and away from the topic at hand than I would like to. So I will set that aside. In the future, perhaps I will talk about Michael's interviews more in different episodes and sort of analyze them, because I could absolutely be doing that all day long with just these a few pages of interview questions and answers. But alas, we will move on. So we have that groundwork about the book. We've obviously read the book, and I'm sure we all have different things we've taken from it throughout that process. With thinking about how to actually discuss this book, it's interesting to me to turn to another writer who has analyzed Dancing the Dream pretty extensively in her own right, and done so in a more academic nature than I have here. So Elizabeth Amisu is an author, an academic, and she wrote a book called The Dangerous Philosophies of Michael Jackson, his music, his persona, and his artistic afterlife. Now, I believe this was published in 2016, but it is a very unique book because the entire book is academic, and it's a deep sort of academic analysis of Michael's career and his art. But what I really like about it is that she intentionally cites Michael's own work, his words, his lyrics, his writing, his videos, everything he's created, things he's said in interviews. Those are the sources she gives most credence to. So rather than a lot of other authors that utilize interviews or media or things like that, Elizabeth Amisu primarily focuses on Michael's own words as the site for analysis and where we can get the most knowledge and understanding of him from, which I personally love because I think it's the most appropriate way to approach Michael and really the thinking behind this entire podcast project. But with that, she has a section within this book, which is honestly, it's an amazing book. It is very well written, extremely well researched and analytical, and there's just a lot to take from it. And she has a section that is on Dancing the Dream specifically. I believe it's chapter 3. And there's a ton of interesting stuff she says about this book, and I'm not going to get into all of it. But what I like is that she breaks down the content of Dancing the Dream into 3 different categories. There's what she calls philosophies, there are poems, and there are parables. And that makes a lot of sense for me here because the parables are those which feel almost like they're religious stories or fables, folk tales, like they have that type of feel to them. And then there are obviously his poems that are written in a verse style. And then there are his philosophies, which are about these larger, grander aspects of life and existence. Something I really appreciate about her breaking this down is it does remind the reader that this was not a traditional collection. And I just want to comment and reference something else she says because I think it's a really helpful way of thinking about the book. In her analysis, Amisu says that Dancing the Dream is in a lot of ways more reflective of what is called a commonplace book rather than a traditional like poetry or short essay collection. She says, quote, "To commonplace is the art of taking extracts from one's reading and placing them under specific headings. It was commonly said to be wasteful to read without taking notes. The commonplace book is a fiercely personal item. In fact, its only unifying feature is usually the person who has collated it. The same is true for Dancing the Dream. Although it has 46 works and several illustrations, it does not have a contents page, and the entries, without subdivision, are presented in a stream of consciousness style, like spontaneous conversation or the piecemeal expressions of a dream state." She goes on to then say in terms of how it is written, "It has been written in a low to middle language level, enabling a wide demographic to engage with its content, from young children for whom there are a plethora of illustrations, to adults who can interpret the complexity of the poetry. Although Jackson's personal religious beliefs are a unifying current that runs through Dancing the Dream, they are offered in the form of universal truths rather than rigid dogmas." From here, she goes on to analyze what she considers the philosophies, which pieces she considers the more traditional poems, and then which she is referring to as parables. She goes on to analyze them, and, she has some really fascinating perspectives on things. Some of them I really agree with and I totally align with how I read it. Some of them I don't read them that way, but it's cool to just see someone engaging in this way with Michael's work in such an academic sense, because as she says, Dancing the Dream is kind of like a best kept secret when it comes to Michael Jackson's legacy. She even says that when there was a tribute issue in Rolling Stone a few years after Michael's death, it's not even mentioned as something that he did. Now, Rolling Stone, we have a complicated relationship with Rolling Stone as fans of Michael Jackson. But needless to say, I think the point still stands that this is not a book that is really known. And even I would venture that even huge fans of Michael Jackson, unless they are really tuned in, do not know about this book either. I've never seen it in a store, never seen it publicly, which blows my mind. I would love to see this book get a little bit of a resurgence when we have the biopic come out next year in April, but we'll see. I'm hoping, if nothing else, his music and his autobiography do, but I would really love to see that for Dancing the Dream. But the last thing I'll bring from Amisu's chapter about Dancing the Dream, because I don't want to lean too much in her own analysis, I just want to draw attention to how she opens the chapter. She says, "There is a pervasive misconception that Michael Jackson did not leave much more behind than a few scattered memories. This presumption stems from an acceptance of him as simply a commercial product, rather than as an artist, a person who has sold records through controversy and spectacle, rather than through dedication and learning. It is a symptom of the reductions his life was plagued with." And I just can't say enough about how much I agree with that statement. I almost feel like it's so factual that it's not something we can agree or disagree with. It's just the reality of how Michael is treated. Michael is absolutely treated in a reductive lens, whether it is Dancing the Dream being overlooked and not known about, or more seriously, accusations that he didn't write his music, or that giving the credit to specific producers for their role in his work, despite most of his major hits being ones that he wrote himself. There's this constant undercurrent of undermining Michael's accomplishments, his talents, his achievements, his philosophies. I would bet there are people who assume Michael didn't write Dancing the Dream, and that he had editors write it, or because he credits people who helped him with it, that they actually wrote it. There's just this ongoing discrediting of Michael. I guess then, once again, one of my goals with this podcast and with this specific season 1 was to give attention to an area of Michael's career and his output that has really been so overlooked and kind of forgotten. So now that we've had some time to discuss Michael's perspective and Elizabeth Amisu's perspective and just the general kind of background and theory about what prompted this book and what it looks like, I want to take a moment to regroup and then finish out with some further discussion of my review of Dancing the Dream. So, working on this project for the last year has genuinely been a pretty amazing experience. So to put in perspective, I am recording this on November 5th, 2025, and that is around a year after first starting working on this project. While I didn't release the first episodes until January, I banked about 10 episodes starting in November of 2024 before I began releasing them. And so I'm at around a year now of solidly and consistently working on this project. And I have to say that this has been an incredibly grounding part of my year in 2025 especially. Now, I want to share a little bit about my thoughts on Dancing the Dream when I first became a fan of Michael Jackson. So when I first discovered Michael, I mean, you know what I mean. I always knew who he was, but when I first discovered him from a fan perspective, I know I've told this story before, but bear with me. It was probably late December 2021, and I started to see videos and reels and things on Facebook and Instagram of Michael Jackson. And I remember it really clearly and distinctly because I was so completely blown away by him. Like instantly, I thought, holy crap. Like, I know I have seen his performances before at some point in my life leading up to then. Obviously, I knew I had seen some of his music videos when I was younger and everything, but I had never as an adult or any time beyond maybe high school seen anything about Michael Jackson. I mean, I really never did. I never watched This Is It when it came out, and I just really didn't. And so I remember just being completely blown away. I saw a random performance of Billie Jean, and I was just like both in awe and in love instantly. And I became obsessed really fast. And so within a month, I was reading about him, watching him constantly, listening to him constantly. And within the first month, I bought a copy of Dancing the Dream. And I remember when I read it, I wasn't really sure what to take from it. I didn't know anything about Michael at that point. I didn't know anything about his personality or his life philosophies or even the particulars of his trauma. I really didn't know much. I mean, I was learning, but I didn't know a lot. And my background was that this was 2021, so I had spent since 2015 in academia, and I had first earned my MFA in creative writing, where I studied fiction and nonfiction and poetry, all of them. It was multi-genre, my program. And then I went on to a PhD also in English, but in rhetoric and writing studies. I was often writing my own poetry and nonfiction. I was publishing my poetry and nonfiction. I was actually an editor and co-founder of a very successful literary magazine for about 7 years. I read a lot of modern poetry, a lot of modern essay, something I've studied. As I've mentioned recently, I've recently had my first book come out, which was in memoir, which is nonfiction. And, so of course I had, and I have still to this day, very strong opinions about these genres and these styles. And when I read Dancing the Dream for the first time, I was really taken aback because the style that Michael writes in is very much outside of the type of work I would normally read. I tend to love very visceral, very intense language, you can even say somewhat convoluted imagery, mixed metaphor. Like I like things like that are a bit more experimental. And Michael's writing in this book, you could say it's very traditional. For example, the poetry throughout the book is largely rhyming poetry. That's not something I typically read. That's not something extremely common in contemporary poetry. But that's throughout the whole book. As Elizabeth Amisu says, it's written on a lower level in terms of it being accessible for children, people of all reading levels. So again, not something that I was typically reading and consuming. But what really struck me when I read this was, I'll be honest with you, I struggled when I first read it to know if I should believe him, because the earnestness in this book, I just didn't know if I should trust it. And that really wasn't about Michael or my perspective on him, because like I said, I didn't know a lot about him. I mean, I had vague memories of the way the media had talked about him when I was younger, but I honestly didn't have some big negative view of him. I was obviously engaging with his art and very invested and interested in learning about him. So it's not like I didn't trust it because of anything about Michael specifically. It just was hard for me to grasp or believe that a man at all, frankly. But a man in his 30s who was basically a billionaire, who was the most famous man in the world, who was ridiculously talented and beloved. It was hard for me to buy that this man was writing the stuff he was writing. It honestly was. I'm just being real with you. I didn't trust it. I thought, this is beautiful and almost uncomfortably idealistic. That's how it made me feel. It made me feel almost embarrassed. And by that, I do not mean about his work, because I didn't feel that way at all, but almost about how it made me feel to read it, where I thought, how is it possible a person who is so famous is so boldly putting this out there for the world to consume, respond to, review, potentially reject? You know, it was shocking to me. So the first time I read the book, I thought, you know, I don't know what I think of this. I mean, there were essays, especially the essays, that made me cry because they were so beautiful and the ideas in them were so pure. And then there were poems that made me feel almost like a little kid to read them, because they reminded me of the way I once thought about life, or the ways that I think about life when I'm at my very best. You know, and it was striking, but I didn't know really what I thought of it. And also, and this is something I said very early on in this series, I was a little bit put off by the glossy style of it. The stills from music videos, the professional photo shoots, the, just the glossy pictorial element of it. Now, again, I loved it as a fan, but as a reader, as someone who reads poetry and reads poetry manuscripts and memoir and takes it very seriously and has studied it, I really was struck by that. And I thought, I don't know. I feel like it cheapens it a little bit. That is what I genuinely thought. So this was a month into my fandom, my first time reading it. And then I decided to revisit it several months later. Because realistically, I became this fan in like late December 2021. And by March, I was spending a fortune buying tickets to see MJ the Musical on Broadway, which I saw in April of that year. I was struggling to get my work done. I was struggling. I was teaching at the time, and I was struggling to grade anything or like plan classes because I was so absorbed in my fascination and obsession with Michael. So just to put in perspective, my original reading was a month in. And then a few months later, I was so much deeper. And so I started reading it again. And once I had learned more about him, I had watched his Oprah interview, which his gentleness just shocked me during. I had learned more about the allegations against him. I had learned more about his childhood. I read Moonwalk twice because I read it back to back because I did not want to be without his voice in my head. That's how crazy I was, you know? My point is, I spent so much time self-educating. And so when I returned to it, I was really shocked by how much I loved it and how sincere it felt to me. Because I was like, wow, all of that was real. You know, we can talk all day about how true or realistic Michael's like quote unquote Peter Pan image is. I'll be honest with you, I don't really buy it. But I do think that he was an unbelievably authentic person when it came to what his actual core values were and what he lived out and how he genuinely believed and felt about life. And the reason I say that is something I've said before on this show, which is that I feel a kindred connection to Michael, where I am no Peter Pan. My life is nothing like that and has not been anything like that. My life has been very complicated and dark at times, but I am propelled forward in my life by my idealism, by my love of life, by my love of people, my empathy, and all of these things are things that I see in Michael. I just had never really seen in anybody to the degree and in the way that he expresses it. So once I learned more about him, I found it easier to believe that it was real and not just some front he was putting on, you know? So while I don't think that whole like Peter Pan image is accurate. I do believe that is a core part of who he was on a human level, because it's a core part of who I am too, even though no one, if they knew my life, would be able to say that about me. So I guess my point is that when I revisited it, I felt a real sincerity to it. And that's what made me disregard my original read of it, which was a little bit more critical and I guess a little bit more cynical. So when it finally came to rereading it, I got so much more out of it. I loved it. And I started to return to it more and more. But this year, doing this project was only the third time I read the entire book in full. Now, again, I've read many pieces multiple times. I've returned to them over and over, but I'm talking about the full book. This is only the third time I've read the full book. And obviously it took me a year, and we took it piece by piece and went deep into every piece. And now, I'm years out from when I first discovered Michael, and I swear I could have a second PhD in Michael Jackson studies. Like, my level of knowledge and deep diving into this man. I'm not going to say I'm an expert beyond other people, especially certain, major fans that have done significant work around Michael, but I am up there. I am confident in my knowledge of Michael Jackson. And rereading it this year with that context that I have gained in the last few years of being a fan, and being able to think deeply about his words and where they come from and why he was sharing them and what he was hoping to achieve, I have gained, I didn't think was possible, but an even deeper respect for Michael Jackson. I am sometimes in awe of him. I mean, I am often in awe of him for so many reasons, but sometimes when I am recording these episodes or editing these episodes, or even re-listening to them, because I do listen to them again to remind myself of the stuff I talked about and, just to hear his pieces again, I am sometimes just completely shocked by how wise I have found him to be and how accessible he has made that wisdom for the world through this work. And so I guess when it comes to reviewing this, I want to review all of it in that context, because I am a person that comes from a very different literary landscape and world than the way this is written and how it is presented. But I have grown such a deep and intense admiration for his writing, for his skill in writing. I think just a couple weeks ago, I read an essay that I was just marveling at everything he contained in just 5 paragraphs. It blew my mind, because he makes every word count and every sentence count. But the writing itself never feels very complex. So that's a real skill, to be able to write poems and essays and stories in a way that anyone reading it could get something from it. It's basically writing without a specific audience in mind, which is so much harder than writing toward a specific audience, because he is trying, as he was as an artist, to appeal to everyone, because his message was so inclusive, and he was so inclusive in spreading that message. So ultimately, reading this last year, in my personal life, I had a lot going on. I've gone through some really, really significant personal changes in the last year. My life has changed in really great ways and challenging ways, and I've been challenged personally in a lot of respects. But that's why I said reading this year has been so grounding for me, because the thing about this book is that every piece offers a kind of wisdom. This book is almost like a spiritual and philosophical resource. I mean, in the interview, he's asked, "Do you consider yourself a philosopher?" And he says, "No." But I think it's impossible to separate what he does in this book from the concept of philosophy, because this book is all about how and why we live. It's about the purpose of everything. It's about who we want to be. It's about who and what we invite into our lives. It's about how we show up for ourselves and for other people. It's about our placement in the world. I mean, this is an existential text. And I started to really have this affirmed for me once we got to part 2, because as I said in some of my later, more recent episodes, I really struggled with what was his reason for separating this into 2 different parts when they're so imbalanced in length. And the only thing I can think is that in the first part, he is giving us this vast array of perspectives and considerations. And the final part, the second part, he is cementing them for us. Almost like, hey, if you didn't get the point in the first part, let me lay it out for you real clear, And that's the way that by the end of this book, I perceived his intention. Now, I know some people might think it's not that serious, but I would beg to differ because I believe everything when it comes to artistic choices, from the format, the way something looks on a page, from the font used, from the order, of course, of everything, from the structure of the entire piece, from the balance of the poetry versus the philosophies versus the essays, however you want to categorize them. I believe it's all intentional. I believe there are probably many scraps that did not end up in this book. And I believe that he very purposefully oriented this book toward a specific alignment with what he wanted to give to the world. There's so much evidence that Michael was a very future-thinking person. There are a ton of interviews with people who worked with Michael who said he recorded everything all the time. Footage that was never released, never used, but he cataloged it. I believe and expect that Michael was probably like that in his life. Now, how organized he was, I do not know, but I believe there's a reason for that. I don't know what Michael had planned for all of that footage. I don't know if he had a plan. I have my own theories, but I'm not going to get into them. My point is that I believe Michael was future-oriented. I believe he wanted to create a catalog of work that would tell the world the story of who he is long after he was gone. I believe that is why he published this book. Moonwalk came out a few years earlier as a traditional celebrity memoir/autobiography. This came out a few years later. This in some ways tells a more complete story of who Michael is, minus the autobiographical details, right? This tells a story of who he is on a core level, what he thinks about when he's alone, what he's anxious about, what are his fears, what are his hopes, how does he view the world, why does he make the choices he does? A lot of those questions could be answered in reading this book. So why would Michael release a book like that? Well, outside of giving the autobiographical details of his life, which he had already done, he was so deeply misunderstood. And the media created an image of him that was very hard for people to relate to and very hard for a lot of people to feel compassionate toward. So I believe he understood his legacy would survive the test of time, but he wouldn't always be here to influence it. And I believe he probably knew or predicted that at some point the narrative around him would be something he couldn't control. So in the long run, I talked about this like 5 months ago, 6-7 months ago, I talked about this, how I believe the reason he created portraits of his image that rival or emulate like royalty or famous historical figures is I believe he was quite literally painting himself, painting his legacy into history. He was cementing who he wanted to be and how he wanted to be viewed by the world through commissioning art, commissioning portraits, things that for any regular person might feel kind of like an ego trip. But for Michael Jackson, knowing who he was, knowing his ideals, what he was trying to achieve, he was creating a historical record with artifacts that reinforced his own power and legacy and importance, so that 100 years from now, 200 years from now, 500 years from now, there would be a record of his impact, and there would be all the proof of it through these portraits and statues and all of these different things that would survive far longer than the critical media culture that existed around him at the time. And I believe this book serves as his record to put forth that way. So that in 100 years, 200 years, 500 years, when people are studying the great figures of this time, and they're looking and seeing that Michael Jackson was one of them, there is a record that is very clearly stating what was guiding his life philosophies. And it's something that he would be able to continue to influence well beyond his lifetime and the generations that came after him. Almost in a way that he wanted it to be a living, breathing record of who he actually was. Because unfortunately, though I think that since Leaving Neverland came out, there has been such an unbelievable turn toward Michael's innocence that, I mean, almost all spaces online, except for Reddit, but we don't talk about Reddit, almost all spaces online and communities online, there is a massive support for Michael. And of course, the media, the major media, does not support him. They maybe never will. But the tides have turned and the narrative has shifted around Michael. I have witnessed it just since being a fan myself. The tide has turned, but the thing is, Michael is still so deeply misunderstood. Let's use Neverland as an example, right? So many people who buy into the allegations against Michael Jackson think of Neverland as this horrific place that he used to attract and ultimately harm children. But if you learn about Michael Jackson at all, if you hear the interviews of the people who worked with him that made Neverland a reality, if you hear stories of the children that visited Neverland, 99.9% of them or more, much more actually, talk about how this was essentially a nonprofit project he created in which he just happened to live there also. And that's not minimizing the fact that it was his residence. But my point is more, it is not known that that was what was driving him. But when you read this book and the way he writes about children and his regard for children and his desire to protect the innocence of children and to see the future in children and to use what we can learn from children, it actually makes it easier to believe that yes, he was a person that did these amazing things with his property that so many people can prove he did and he intended. So I guess my point is that this book serves as such an important part of Michael Jackson's legacy. And he covers so many vast themes throughout it. I named a couple just now in terms of innocence, in terms of children, in terms of philosophies about how to approach the world and show up in the world for others. But there's also themes about environmentalism, spirituality, relationships, self-esteem, self-worth, religion, poverty, social justice, animals, magic, tenacity. There is so many themes that he explores in this book, and they are all so perfectly and so quintessentially Michael Jackson. And I like to say sometimes, as you've all heard me say, Michael's duality is so significant, where he is this dynamite, passionate, wild animal of a performer. And I mean that in the absolute best way possible. I mean, he is so electrifying to watch perform that you would never think that this person in his private life was anything but all of those things and more, But his gentleness and his sensitivity and his love and his compassion and his empathy and his interest and investment in the world and his deep thinking about life, these are the things that drove who he was on stage. And they're also the things that drove who he was in his life and how he created the book that he created and all the themes he touches upon. So there's just so much to gain from this in wanting to understand him. I feel that I've grown to understand him much more than I did before. And I also feel that I understand myself and my own perspectives on life even more. Because of course, as I said, my interpretation of Michael's words is my interpretation alone. I am sure there are times that you're listening to me and you're like, what is she talking about? Absolutely not, which is completely valid because we're all going to take his words differently. But it is my hope that in my discussing each of these pieces at such length and offering my own perspectives on his word choices and what I think he was trying to accomplish and the themes that were emerging, it is my hope that I've given you some insight into how you can interpret this work and how it can mean something to you, and maybe even perspective on what Michael may have meant. I don't have any illusions that I understand Michael better than anyone else. I want to believe I do, of course, but I never met this man, and I unfortunately am not going to meet him, not in this lifetime at least. And so everything I say is from the perspective of being a person who just deeply wants to understand him and strives to understand him. And I do feel I've gotten another layer of understanding from him. So before I wrap up, I just want to mention a couple of my favorite pieces, as well as a couple of my favorite episodes from this entire project. One of my early favorites from this book is called Dance of Life, and it is episode 5, which I originally released in January of last year, which is just crazy. But this is one of my favorite pieces because it is so playful. Michael is talking to the moon and interacting with the moon and confessing in some way to us his relationship to the moon as well as his relationship to dance. And he has some lines I just love in this piece, such as referring to himself as the moon's favorite lunatic and how he takes the light from the moon as a gift only to give again. Just absolutely beautiful. In this episode, he also reflects on being a star and what we see when we're looking at stars in space. And he talks about how at any given moment we're looking into the past. And there's a kind of sadness and nostalgia there, but also kind of appreciation as well. And I just remember really loving this piece and connecting with it. So I wanted to highlight that for you. Another one of my favorite pieces was episode 9, So the Elephants March. And in this piece, Michael refers to the wisdom of elephants as well as the wisdom of the animal world. And I actually referenced it very recently in, I think it was last week's episode actually, Look Again, Baby Seal. And Michael's reverence for animals and their wisdom and his hope that we can be forgiven by them. I love this piece because I love seeing through lines in Michael's work. And, a through line obviously from When Elephants March is in Earth Song, when he says, what about animals? What about elephants? And he's crying out in despair for them. So I love this, again, seeing that connection, but also just, as always, Michael's wisdom and empathy when it comes to looking at other animals in this world. I absolutely love it. On that same line, one of my favorite episodes and one of my favorite pieces is episode 11, which covered the piece Enough for Today. Now, if you've been here since the very beginning, you know that in Enough for Today, I cried. It was my first time, I think, crying while recording. And it was because in Enough for Today, Michael is reflecting on his dance rehearsal and when these thoughts of a dolphin being caught and killed is absolutely distracting him and upsetting him to such a degree he has to end his dance practice. And the rest of the piece is in reflection of this sensitivity and pain and concern for animals. And it made me cry because when I had first read this book, it was one of those essays that stuck out to me and made me feel that kinship with Michael that I was talking about before. It's one of the first times in my whole life I have felt really not alone when it comes to my own sensitivity about the world, when I felt really truly seen and understood. And I got that from Michael freaking Jackson. Someone who people say is totally unrelatable because his life was of such extremes and, he had a life unlike anyone else. And that is true. But Michael's humanity was never and should never have been in question, because there is so much in Michael himself that is relatable, even if his experiences were so extraordinary, you know? So anyway, I just love that piece. Of course, I can't say enough about the opportunities to read and analyze the songs and words from both Heal the World, which is featured in episode 13, and Will You Be There, which is in episode 38. Michael's decision to include lyrics or, similar writing to what is in those songs, it is so brilliant, because those are two of his most powerful songs that he wrote that communicate so much about who he truly was, and the nature of having them printed forces us as readers to slow down and really sit with his meaning. And so I just took so much joy from being able to really sit with those words. And I think I cried in both of those episodes too. So what can I say? I probably cried in a third of the episodes, but I'll start with enough for today. But there's just something to love about each of these, Some of my other absolute favorite episodes to record was Love, which was episode 21. And it wasn't so much for the piece, although I liked the piece a lot, but because I just love Michael so much. And I feel like I just really let it out that day. I just gushed and gushed about how much I love him. And it was just super fun for me. I had such a good time with it. I also absolutely loved the Ryan White episode, which was episode 24, because I just love that piece. I love that it was one of the most grounded pieces in the entire book, because it was about a real person, and it was Michael kind of opening up his own vulnerability and showing that he was harmed by this and that he was hurt by it. In that episode, I also really enjoyed reading an excerpt from Ryan's memoir in which he talks about Michael, and reading a little bit of Michael's own words about Ryan also. So I liked that episode because it went a little bit beyond just the piece itself. So it made it really enjoyable for me to get to go a little bit deeper. I also absolutely loved Two Birds, which is episode 27. Two Birds is such a sweet piece, and it was funny because I was reading someone else's review of it recently, and they interpreted it totally differently than I did. And so it was cool to see that, I get something so different out of these pieces than a lot of other people, and vice versa, I'm sure. And it's just really cool that I can love a piece so much and find such beauty and spiritual depth in something that someone else sees in a totally different way. But I remember recording that episode and editing that episode, and just kind of how good it felt to explore the ideas he talks about there. Two Birds is such a sweet piece. It's such a relational piece. And we don't get a lot of that from Michael, he's pretty close to the vest when it comes to the things he shares about himself and his relationships and the way he views his relations to other people. And so it's just like, it was a cool thing to be able to engage with that more. There are so many more pieces that I could talk about, what they meant to me, how they affected me. I have to say, I think some of my favorites were the last two. Honestly, the one in the mirror and Look Again, Baby Seal. These two essays were I think they are just stunning. They are beautifully written. They are deep. They are reflective, and they really make you question yourself and see yourself and take accountability in different ways. And there's so many pieces throughout this book that do that. There's so many pieces that kindly but firmly ask you to look inward. And I can't stress enough how difficult that is to do as a writer, but how difficult that is to do as a writer trying to reach all audiences. My God, we could talk all we want about the elevated craft of certain poets and writers, but with Michael, the very accessibility of his writing is so much of his genius. And I just can't stress enough how much I see that with him. And I just absolutely love it. And I gained so much from it. I guess I'll finally say I really enjoyed the process of creating some of the bonus episodes as well. They weren't about Dancing the Dream, but they really did spring from my love of Michael. And that's honestly what I could say this entire project was for me. This entire season for me was a celebration, a very deep and sincere celebration of my incredible love and admiration and respect for Michael Jackson. So I am going to leave it there because I'll be honest, there are no pieces I didn't like. There are pieces that I like more than others. There's pieces that I think could have maybe been condensed with others, but I see the purpose in all of them, and I respect the decision to include all of them. And I do ultimately understand Michael's decision to include artwork, to include photography, especially recognizable photography, like from his music videos and things, as well as photography specifically taken for this book. I have to keep for myself the context of when this came out in mind. You know, in the 90s, it's not like it was easy to find pictures of your favorite person and favorite celebrity, you know, other than magazines and things. It's not like you could just Google it or have 1,000 photos in your gallery like I do. Is that an embarrassing revelation? Yes, probably. But anyway, you know, back at that point, it was really a gift for fans to be able to have access to these kinds of photos, especially ones that were exclusively taken for the book. So I really can't fault that at this point. And I do understand it. Plus, of course, it created a more of an appeal for people to buy this book. And ultimately, that's how I think of Michael's whole image. I mean, Michael is this incredibly vibrant, exciting performer. He has talent just bursting from his seams. He's beautiful and he's sexy and he's exciting and he's all these great things. But ultimately, what all of that achieves is it gets you in your seat, hearing him and hearing his message. And so I believe the photos serve that purpose too. Hey, you want photos of me? Yes, but here's all these philosophical musings for you to contend with as well, you know? And so I respect it. I get it and I respect it. And I see that that's kind of how he used his image throughout his career. Michael Jackson is one performer you cannot possibly pay attention to and still accuse of letting his entire ego and desire for praise be the motivating factor for his work. While I am completely sure that existed because he's only human, you know, I believe Michael's mission is so profoundly connected to the messages in this book, and that he utilized his talent and his charisma and his magic. He used those things to get people to hear him because those were the gifts he was given. And that vision was what he was given. And he did it and he achieved it. And it's so evident in this book. So with that said, I am going to draw this review, this very long review, my goodness. I am going to draw this review to a close. And with that, this season 1 of reading Michael Jackson to a close. It has been an absolute pleasure and honor to have this conversation with you for the last year. Reading Michael Jackson will have a season 2. I am currently working on it. I am beginning to build a plan and a schedule. And as soon as I feel comfortable sharing that with complete confidence in my ability to fulfill it, I will let you know. And I will drop a trailer and you will hear what I have planned in the coming months. But until then, I invite you to please leave comments. Tell me your favorite piece from the book. Tell me what you gained from the book, or even from listening to this podcast in the process of examining this book. Tell me what you love about Michael Jackson. Tell me anything. I would love to hear from you. And if you don't feel comfortable commenting publicly, please feel free to email me at readingmichaeljackson@yahoo.com. This has been a wonderful year that I have spent working on this project and talking with you all from afar. As we close, I want to wish you a wonderful end to your 2025. I hope if you celebrate the holiday season this fall and early winter, I hope you have a beautiful, warm, happy, merry, healthy, and safe and loving holiday season. And I will talk to you all again very, very soon. And until then, take care.